Okay, so here we go. Keep going on the right angle cross of consciousness with the 3-5 profile. The third line is difficult. Compulsiveness, the fear endangered by the sense of helplessness, resulting in unnecessary stress and activity. Oh, how I yearned able to teach the third line surrender. Because you can see what happens when the third line does not surrender. It has all of these compulsive activity. In other words, helplessness is the enemy of the not self sacral. Helplessness is its enemy. The moment that the sacral has the assumption that its helpless power is the moment that it's in its deepest dilemma. Compulsiveness can be limited in a negative effect through flights of imagination. Though still stressful, they do not lead to action, or it cannot stand still, unable to surrender and at odds with one's own rhythm. The whole thing is that the sacral is a compulsive motor. It's such a thing. Feeling my children gear down at night, I can feel this incredible power of the sacral. I'm just waiting to see the sacral slowly moving towards its exhaustion point. Unnecessary stress and activity. Now connect this to the 3-5. Unnecessary stress and activity in your consciousness. It's the right angle cross of consciousness, stress and activity, but all the things that you're thinking about. Third line beings on this cross is that there's all this stress and they have to do or do something about it, and they do it and then it backfires, and then there's all this stress and there's all this activity running around. Helplessness. Oh, and the sacral is so powerful. Helplessness is not something that you get just like that. My whole thing about waking up to generators, my whole pitch to generators, that they're the holy ones. It's true. I wish you'd get it. Until generators accept and understand and live helplessness, we are all in trouble because we all end up with the stress and activity rooted in frustration. And everybody is saying, I don't like this pattern. I don't want this pattern. I want the pattern. I want that pattern. I want the other pattern. And the people who have the pattern are saying, I like this pattern. I want this pattern. Nothing works. We know what happens to the 3-5. The moment that the pattern doesn't work, they pack their bags and run away because everybody says it's their fault. When I first titled the first human design book as No Fault Manual, it was only thinking about 3-5. May the gods protect them because 3-5 can really go nuts. No fault, no blame, no choice because we're all helpless. There's nothing more difficult to get across to a sacral, as I've discovered. If you tell somebody who's a non-sacral that they're helpless, at some level they know that. They just know it because they're not the life force. And they know that the sustenance in life comes from elsewhere, even though they don't understand the language or how to deal with it. But when you're dealing with a sacred being and you tell them they're helpless, this is folding a red flag to a mad bull. They don't like it at all and they become incredibly compulsive. Who else is going to teach you surrender? It's my third line mind that teaches you surrender. No one else is going to teach you surrender. And every time we see the dilemma and the negatives of the three, remember it's positive. It's not about one is weightier than the other, weightier. It's a balance, but it's essential to recognize that the very journey into the mountain that the third line penetrates so deeply is that in the end it's the potential to recognize helplessness, and in recognizing helplessness, surrender to response. Most generators, when they hear about response, they don't see it as a surrender mechanism. They think that they're doing something because they're responding. It gives the sacred this illusion that it's still in charge. But this is the beginning of the true surrender process. If all generators were surrendered, everybody else automatically would be, because they conditioned the life force. One of the things about the 3-5 is that it's so difficult for them in this context to surrender. They're pessimistic. Every time that things don't work, they lose their reputation. They don't want to surrender to the fact that they have failed, that life isn't right. It doesn't work for them. They keep on going somewhere else. They keep on trying to start over. It's the keep on power. It's a third line thing. After all, this deep power to just stay with things. And yet, here for the 3-5, there's really a dilemma for them. I know many 3-5s on the island because this is a great escaped island. He's talking about Ibiza. And the level of compulsiveness as a general phenomenon is so evident and the complete opposite to surrender. In other words, the generator turned manifester, insisting that there's no such thing as helplessness. There are only weaknesses. Okay, then we go to the 3-6. I would imagine that 3-6 and particularly 3 personality in this day age are offered more Prozac than anybody else to calm them down. It's amazing, by the way, how much our allopathic medicine is designed to slow down the sacral and to distort sacral frequency without really understanding what it is in fact that they are doing. The 3-6 is going to be particularly compulsive in the early part of the process. And that compulsiveness is simply that the pattern has so many variables, and every variable they seem to touch seems to lead to a confrontation with the forces of the power. In other words, the whole thing about surrender is that if you're a sacred being and you're endowed with power, you weren't born with a white flag in your hand. You were endowed with power to make things happen and not self-programmed to build everything. A great display of power. For the 3-6, it's obvious right now from the beginning that the whole thing is awful. It's really sad and depressing. And the compulsiveness in the sadness and the depression. They're compulsively pessimistic. They can't help it. By the way, if you wake up in your 3-6 and if you're longer pessimistic, you haven't woken up. Pessimism is the theme, so you deal with pessimism, but the theme that is starting at a place. If you're going to do any logical research, you have to start somewhere. If you're going to do anything logical in pattern, you start somewhere. You can start at the third line being with pessimism. It's correct. And you're always starting from that point. But it doesn't mean that that point is accurate. It's just the beginning of the process. And it doesn't mean that all pessimism leads to ultimately to optimism. As a matter of fact, in the 3-6, particularly pessimism can lead to even greater pessimism. In other words, you first discover that people aren't nice. And then you discover they're really not nice. This is the pessimism leading to the pessimism. It's so difficult to be a 6-line being and you're one of those most rigidly patterned fixed gate on the sacral center, and how difficult it is for the mutation to find a place in this. So one of the tendencies of the 3-6 on this cross is that they prefer to be in the mud than on the roof. It's interesting about the 3-6. If you're dealing with a 4-6 or the 6-2, you're dealing with aspects that really appreciate and enjoy the roof. The roof is wonderful. As a matter of fact, they're the ones that find it very difficult to come off the roof. But when you're dealing with a 3-6 or a 6-3, they don't necessarily prefer the roof. Sometimes the roof is really boring, and they always have this ability to climb down and to go slumming and to get into the mud and to get into the rumble and get into the dirt and get into the stuff. So it's one of the things here about these 3-6 is that they indulge themselves in compulsive pessimism. In other words, these are beings that are looking for things that will only get worse, and they go deeper and deeper and deeper into it. It's quite a phenomenon, yeah. It's not something very easy for these poor 3-6s.